Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about New Historicism. So, the existence of New Historicism implies the existence of Old Historicism. Old Historicism is, it was actually just called Historicism. It wasn't called Old Historicism at the time, but Historicism is a discipline that kind of existed alongside New Criticism. And whereas New Criticism says everything that you need to know is available in the text, you don't need outside context, you don't need to know about the author, you don't need to know about the historical or cultural background of a particular piece of work. Historicism says that stuff's important. But historicism, old historicism, tended to take a very broad view of that history. So you would want to have, for instance, a sense of ancient Rome if you were going to write about Ovid, or if you were going to write about Cicero, or if you were going to write about Seneca, or whatever it is. You would want to know, here's what the Romans were about. New Historicism is much more detail-oriented. New Historicism, and really Stephen Greenblatt is one of the champions of this. New Historicism comes along kind of, I think, starting really in the 60s and says, actually what we need is much more focused information about history. So the New Historicists, for instance, might say, all right, I'm looking at this play from 1597. This is the kind of thing that Greenblatt would do, Shakespeare era, 1597. And so I'm going to, and there's this one reference in this play. So I'm going to, it's something about laws, something about, let's give it a concrete example. This is a reference about eating fish in a Shakespeare play from 1597. So what I'm going to do as a new historicist is go back and read all of the laws passed under Elizabeth's reign about fish eating. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot more of them than you might expect. In part because during the Renaissance, during the early modern period, the English Navy, the ships were also fishing ships. So they did sort of double service. And so people were required by law to eat fish on certain days of the week in order to ensure that the Navy had plenty of revenue. This is the kind of thing that new historicists are really interested in. And so now you read that reference to fish in the context of, all right, in 1582, X specific law was passed, and that law shaped the world in which Shakespeare wrote that particular line. So the idea, or one of the assumptions behind New Historicism is that art is mimetic. And basically that's a fancy way of saying art reflects the world, not just in broad brushstrokes, which was the old historicist approach. Again, you would need to know, how did the Elizabethans look at the universe? How did people under Elizabeth see, like the philosophy of the great chain of being, for instance. That was something you would want to know in order to apply it to Shakespeare's plays. But you didn't, under old historicism, need to dig into, like, here's a specific sermon that was given or a specific pamphlet that was in circulation at the time, and I can take that information from this specific document or specific law or specific event, and I can find echoes of that in this play or this poem or this novel or whatever it is. New historicism is much more interested in those very specific connections. The idea that the piece of art is going to specifically reflect the things that were going on in the world. So it's a mimetic relationship, a mirroring relationship, where the art reflects the things that are going on in the real world. One of the things that makes New historicism, therefore, sort of challenging is that what interpretations you can have of a particular piece of literature really depend on what you know about the past. So if you happen to know about this law from 1582, but not this revision to the law from 1589, then your interpretation is going to be very different than the person who knows about both the 1582 law and the 1589 revision. And this is this is always a problem with any discipline that's historically grounded. We have limited information about the past. We have limited knowledge and limited ability to appreciate everything that was going on. But that means that two different new historicist critics may look at the same text and come to radically different conclusions based on what information they have available to them. And actually, that's not necessarily something that new historicism believes is a bad thing. And actually, that's not something that a responsible literary critic is going to think is a bad thing. I mean, this is, again, the great insight of reader response criticism, ultimately, that grounds all modern literary scholarship, is that we're all embedded within particular communities of knowledge, particular ways of reading and interpreting, and new historicism accepts that there are limits to what any individual person is going to know, and therefore each individual is going to have their own reading based on their own constellation of knowledge and their own communities of reading. And that's a good thing. For the new historicist, I think it's a good thing as well, even though I'm not a new historicist. But one of the other big things in new historicism, and this goes along with a debate that occurs in history as a discipline around the same time, the mid to late 60s into the 70s and up through today, which is the question of historiography. Now, historiography basically means the way in which history is narrated. Because history is not just chronology, it's not just event 1 happens, then event 2, then event 3, then event 4, etc., etc. Starting in the 60s, historians began to say, what we're actually doing is telling stories, and those stories align with particular frameworks. So people like Hayden White became really, really influential in this. This emergence of what's sometimes called postmodern historiography. This idea that two different historians can narrate the same events in two different ways because they may apply two different frameworks to them. One will apply a tragic framework, the downfall of a civilization, and one will apply a comic framework, or one will apply a romantic framework, or whatever it is. And these are, in some ways, literary frameworks, but they shape the way that historians are capable of thinking about history, because history is storytelling, because history is the narration of events to show cause and effect, to show relationships, etc., etc. And New Historicism is really grounded in this idea that we narrate the connections between certain events, battles, laws, political decisions, whatever it is. We narrate the relationship between these things and literary texts. Now, one of the other big questions that comes up in terms of New Historicism is, how should we understand these relationships? And this is where somebody like Michel Foucault, one of the most famous and influential literary and cultural theorists, comes in. Foucault really challenges this fairly straightforward reading that you sometimes get with New Historicism of, I'm connecting X thing to Y text in order to illuminate Y text. Foucault creates a sort of broader framework that's still historically rooted. He draws on discourse theory and what he calls the archaeology of knowledge. So rather than necessarily being as focused on specific historical events or things, Foucault starts to say, all right, let's look at how this constellation of things that are going on at a particular time shapes what people at that time were able to conceptualize. So it becomes about, so we have the discourse, that is the kinds of things that are being said, the kinds of things that are being thought, the kinds of things that are privileged, and even the kinds of things that seem possible to think at a particular time. Because our horizons for what we can think, what we can see as legitimate ideas, change over time. And Foucault starts to say, okay, this discourse is all about creating power within a particular socio-cultural context, a particular nation, a particular town, a particular whatever, at a particular time. The discourse shapes what's allowable, what kinds of ideas are conceivable. And that's a way of structuring power. And so Foucault comes up with this idea. He develops this idea over the course of his career that particular ways of knowing the world are deeply rooted in power structures. So, for instance, in his book, The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault talks about medical discourse. He talks about the way that medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, is used to limit the scope of social norms and to pathologize certain behaviors in order to enforce those social norms. And this becomes, again, this is a slightly broader approach than what we get in maybe more traditional limited New Historicism. This is a broader look that draws on some of the principles of old historicism, but roots it in specific concrete details in the same way that New Historicism does. So, New Historicism as a discipline is extremely useful for literary scholars because it grounds us in actual contexts rather than broad brushstroke statements, and often old historicism simply relies on overt generalizations that aren't necessarily well-founded. So New Historicism is much more data-driven, much more detail-driven, much more evidence-driven, but it also tends to assume a very specific relationship, that is the mimetic relationship, the mirroring relationship between a text and the society that produces that text. And that's not always necessarily the case, or the way that we may read those connections is not necessarily always reasonably grounded.